anyone has a question? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your conference. It's a pleasure for the Ministry of Education to have you here today. So thank you so much for coming to the seminar and to talk about an issue that is really relevant for us. So as you know, Spain has made a great effort in investing in education, in pre-primary education. We have a really high enrollment rate in pre-primary education, and I would like to first to ask you what happens in Spain, because it seems that we are not getting the payoff of such an investment. At least for now, it might be that in the next year we are going to get it. This is the first question, and the second one is about if you could elaborate and give us a higher insightful of what channels allow education, primary education, to affect non-cognitive skills of the kids, because it's really surprising the kind of impact that we have found in the empirical evidence of those kids attending a pre-primary education later on in their education outcomes later on, or even in their labor outcomes. So, and I guess that most of the impact comes through non-cognitive skills. You were talking yesterday about the impulse control analysis that have been done, or exercises that have been done in some schools, and also the fact that kids coming from high income families have a higher level of or know more words than those coming from poorer families. So these kind of issues, I think it would be very interesting for us if you could talk us about it.
I don't have enough detailed information on the Spanish case, but I can tell you just generally based on the cases that we know, not only for the US, but generally what we've found for different countries on this issue. The question is, what is the payoff, and how do we know that this is a good investment? That is, at the theoretical level, it appears to be what we want to do based on the scientific findings of personality, brain development, nervous system development, and so on. It's logical. What we see are that children who do not get similar attention in the home because of a lack of resources, education of the parents, material resources, do more poorly in school. And so again, there's that connection. Well, maybe if they got these services through these particularly early childhood programs, we would start to see more equalization of performance in the school. So there's a strong logic to this. But then the question is the empirical results. And I think the most important empirical result that we get is that quality is important. And that in many countries, you set out a national program, but if you go from center to center, you find big differences in what is actually happening to children at those centers. In some cases, for example, the personnel are not well trained, they don't have good leadership. I mentioned before, it's really an employment program instead of a child program. And we certainly have had that in the US. And in those particular cases, the results do not seem very good. So I think that there are some principles of quality. Some of them I've mentioned. Some of them have a great cost. Others probably don't, but they do have important political implications. If we give communities funding and ask them to start the center and then give them especificaciones, this is what the center will look like, but now the money is in the hands of a particular group, they will hire their, I'm making a generalization, so you'll excuse me, but they will hire their friends, they will hire the friends of the friends, they will hire the children, and the nephews and so on, and that doesn't necessarily make a good center. In fact, what we find is in those particular cases, they appear to be getting the same resources as other centers. On paper, they have the same program, they have the same hours, same eligibility, and yet the results are quite poor. So my own view is that there's a professional and a quality dimension, but there's also a political dimension. This is public money, and I don't have to tell anyone in Spain that when you're spending public money, if you don't have careful accountability, you get some very interesting kinds of consequences, such as fish farms in Galicia, or the Ave in Valencia. Or I can give many examples, even though I'm ignorant of your country, okay? And all the parties are involved, by the way. I don't believe that there are partidos limpios and partidos sucios. I think that there are good people in both parties, but there are also others who see these as opportunities. This gets into the early childhood education industry, because there are a lot of resources that have to be invested in this industry, I think, as we all know. So this would be my first concern. To generalize about what is happening is to ignore the fact that in some places wonderful things are happening, and in other places the money is just being wasted. It's being used for other purposes. It's not being used. The first priority is not what is happening to the development of children, but what is happening is to the lives of adults who have connections in the community. This is a very impolite answer. I realize that, you know, you shouldn't, especially in a government agency, you shouldn't speak this way. But remember that I am not Cristobal, and I did not come here at government expense, okay? So that would be my first concern. Now, the second concern would be this. When you measure the results, there are some big surprises. Yesterday I mentioned the reduction in class size in this very large experiment in the States. And a lot of people criticized it by saying, well, you know, they have some reductions, they have some improvements in academic achievement in the early grades, but they disappear later. And in fact, our good friend Hanushek says, look, most of the results are in the first year or two. And in the third and fourth year of a smaller class size, there's no effect. But in fact, when we follow up, and this is one of the things that I would really encourage in Spain, when we follow up over years, not just limiting the evaluation to the time of the treatment, you find interesting things. And in the case of this reduction in class size in the early grades, what you find is results right into the labor market many years later. I mean, you were taking children 5, 6, 7, 8, reducing their class size. You find that at the end of secondary school, they are more likely to complete and get degrees. They have higher test scores. Many years later, higher achievement. They were less likely to have been retained in grade. They were less likely to have been found with disabilities. Then you follow them into the period after the elementary and secondary school. They were more likely to have succeeded in post-secondary education. They have higher earnings, better occupational placements from this early intervention. So one of the questions is whether the assessments are going far enough. And again, look, I know that these things are very costly. A longitudinal evaluation, first of all, it requires devotion to the work and the research, even if there are 10 changes in government in the interim. So that's the biggest obstacle to doing anything over the long term. The fact that each government has a particular life. God knows whether the government will continue 4 years from now, 5 years from now, 8 years from now. And what we need to do is to separate out the scientific work that we do with government support from who is in power, because we need the time to see what the effects are.
Thank you. Our figures in childhood education in Spain is one of the highest in Europe, maybe 95 or 96%, no? But at the same time, our figures in dropout also is one of the highest in Europe. The second, maybe 24 or 23, the last figure, no?
Yeah.
And in your presentation, one of the consequences of this study is a very good childhood education makes better education, better results in education.
Yeah.
And in our cases, it's a question of the quality of the preschool education, or are there another important factors to make this contradictory and important situation in our educational system?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is, and it's implicit in your question. It's to some degree, it's a good question, but a rhetorical question too, because there are many other factors that determine the dropout rate. Let me go back to the example that I gave for the Perry preschool. These were poor black children without fathers in the home, which is unfortunately a very classical example in an urban area, very poor urban area. So what is the expectation? Well, we can tell from the control group. Remember that the comparison is between the control group and the experimental group. I'm not good for remembering all the numbers precisely, but it was something like this. 57% of the control group completed secondary school. And the treatment group, it was almost 70%. So you could say, well, que fracaso, 30% de fracasos y 70%. But the point is that this is a population that has all kinds of difficulties, obstacles, and so on. And just one intervention is not going to solve all of those. It's not going to get them in wonderful housing. It's not going to give them access to all kinds of services, including, health care and so on. In fact, one of the problems that we face is that even the group, although the group has better health, they're taking care of themselves better, they have more education, so they know, they understand, less substance abuse. So we say, do you all know what that word means, substance abuse? It means beber. Okay. No kidding. See, I was young once too. I don't look like I was young once, but I was. Okay. But the important point is that this is one intervention, and it clearly improved the lives of this particular group. Did it create nirvana? Absolutely not. And without talking about the creation of nirvana, one of the things is when you get older, when you're younger, yes, that's what we look for. But as you get older, you just look for mejoramiento. And that's really, I think, the point here, that there's an improvement relative to what there would have been in the absence of the treatment. And that's what we want to look for. And we want to make sure it's not just a very small, we want to make sure it's large enough that this is worth doing, that it really has value. So those are the criteria that we would use, okay?
This is a question we've received from Twitter. So you've already kind of answered it, but if you could elaborate on it. It says, like, in terms of economy, like payoff, where would you put the emphasis on investing on higher education or preschool?
Yeah, that sounds like a very straightforward question, but it turns out it's quite difficult because it depends on the efficacy of our educational system. Where our system, has the most power, eficaz. And I think that differs from country to country, and it differs among populations. Today, I can give you an answer in the States. In the States, we are putting more and more emphasis on the early childhood education. And some of you are familiar with the work of James Heckman. And Heckman argues that empirically, the investments really are more important early, and his reasoning is the following. He uses a biblical term, and I have no idea what it is in Spanish, but in the Bible, in the Old Testament, they talk about each generation producing another generation. They use a term that we don't really use in English called begat. B-E-G-A-T. Begat. That the generation of Noah begot Shem and Ham and so on. And sometimes there are pages and pages in the Old Testament that tell you all the generations, like a genealogy or something of this sort. And Heckman uses that term, and he says that early investments begot success later, and the efficacy of later investments, because you need certain level of preparation in order to benefit from investments later. And he makes the argument empirically on admittedly not perfect data that you can actually show that. And he's done some very, very important work in this area. So if his view is correct, and at least more and more people believe that's correct, then it's the early childhood investment that you, at least at the margin, I mean, we're talking at the margin, that you would shift resources. Because if children get a very good start and then succeed in the primary school, this gives them much better educational capacity and orientations in the secondary school, and it creates another generation of success and so on. So I would have to say that in general that's the direction that we're moving in. But again, we need a caveat. And the caveat is this: it's got to be high quality at the early level. And that's often, my colleague, Steve Barnett, I should tell you that Steve Barnett has a center at Rutgers University called the National Institute for Early Education Research, NIRE. This is really worth going to on the internet, because he has so much both empirical and conceptual information and data on this topic. And I think it's very useful data. Steve Barnett is an economist, and he is the one who did the first analysis of the Perry preschool that showed that the benefits relative to costs are very high. And this was years ago. I mean, this was not yesterday. This was 1983. His first results were published. But in all of his speeches and his writing, he doesn't talk about the need for early childhood education. He talks about the need for quality early childhood education, because there are many places, both within countries and among countries, where they tell you we are providing this kind of program, this kind of service, but when you look, it's very mediocre. And as I mentioned, inside of our countries, in our Head Start program, there are centers that you would never send your child to if you were a volunteer, if you could do this through your own discretion. But it may be the only one in the area, and it's there for adult employment, not for children. It's not even doing good things for children, and maybe it's doing bad things, ignoring children, sick children, all kinds of things. So anyway, the quality, that's really important. So I would say quality investments in early childhood education should be a first priority at the margin as we hopefully put more investment into education.
Another question? Anyone else? Yes, a question trying to connect with the first comments that they made. I think that we have made a great effort in Spain to reach almost 100% of students, of 4-year-old students in schools. That's very important. But the problem is, I think, is how all of them are in school. But the problem is what kind of intervention we can make in schools. And sometimes when you see studies in the US, you have data collected at this level, and you can try to explain how a smaller class size, or I don't know, if a student is retained in the kindergarten before starting primary school, or I don't know, if you raise teacher salaries, you can see the effects. And that's something very, it's totally impossible to do in Spain. And I think that we have a good opportunity here. We have many different regions. They have governments, and maybe you said that it's very, costly to make an experiment. But maybe if we want to know exactly what are the effects of different interventions, I think that autonomous regions, autonomous communities should make an effort and try to implement this kind of experimental design, or at least they should try to collect information from this level in early childhood education, and try to follow those students across the system. That would be very interesting. So you can really, not to say we have high level or high percentage of students in the schools, but what happens inside the class, and what are the teachers doing in that level. I think that would be very important to see the specific intervention at that level and try to follow the results, so we can in the future maybe have results similar to the preschool study that you have in the States.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I can add to what Jose Manuel just said, because I agree that in our societies generally, we need to become much more experimenting societies to find out what works. And I think this is an interesting way to go. I mean, one of the problems is that our professions, certainly the educational professions, but the health professions, all the professions become very stubborn about what works. If you were to go to teachers, for example, or educators, they will tell you the proper way to provide this service or that service, or to teach this subject. They don't seem to have this curiosity, let's put it that way, this curiosity that maybe some of the things we are doing are very sound, very good, but maybe there are some ways we can improve this. And how can we improve this? And if you ask them that question, they will give you their opinions. And if you ask them the question of do you have some evidence on that? Even that question will create, because the view is, I am a profesor, I am an expert in this subject. They may not use those terms, but the point is, I'm a professional, I know. I have been teaching for 23 years. And by the way, that's true in the university too. So I'm not just talking about the maestría or profesores de la secundaria. I'm talking about all of us, you know. And one of the things is, I would use the term, we need a society that's not only experimental, but that's a sociedad curiosa. We need to be open about this. We have some answers, some good answers. We don't have to pretend we know nothing. But there are always ways that we can improve things. But the only way that we know how to improve things is to provide some evidence, to try things and provide some evidence. And not everything works, you know. Some things, there's éxito, there's fracaso. But through fracaso, we learn things too. So, I mean, that's my view. That's, for me, that's what makes my life, my professional life so interesting. Because there's so much more to know. You know, there's an expression that I heard from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a senator, and he was also an intellectual. In fact, one of the few intellectual senators in the U.S. And he said to me, when I mentioned to him about, I said, you know, we've worked so hard on this, and yet we still know so little. And he said, get used to it, because the larger you make the circle of light, the greater the perimeter of darkness. That's okay. He said, get used to it. He said, that's okay. So all I can do is agree with you that this is the direction that we need to go.
Thank you very much, Professor Levin. I was very interested in the way you put the social and emotional learning, the big part it has on early childhood education. So could you elaborate a little bit more about how can you measure this kind of learning in your experimental studies, and how can you follow up this along the educational career of your participants?
Yeah. Well, talking of the perimeter of darkness, you have helped me to enter the perimeter of darkness, because I'm not a measurement person. I'm not an expert on measurement. I know a little bit about it because we have a project right now in which we are doing benefit cost studies of investments in socio-emotional learning. So I've been reading about it and talking with some experts, but I myself am not an expert. However, I will give the example that I gave yesterday in talk. One of the problems that, at least in the States, that we face is that children from very low educational backgrounds, that is where the parents have very low education, often lack vocabulary, ways of speaking, ways of talking. Now that's on the side, cognitive side. But when they enter school, we also notice that they don't behave appropriately to learn. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, one of the things that we have to do when we enter school is what? We have to listen. And these children don't have any impulse control. If you start to talk and they don't understand what you are saying, they often immediately lose interest, act out. They will start talking. They might have conflict. Oh, they see a toy that they want that another child has. They just grab it. They lack what we call impulse control, or what the brain scientists call executive function. And executive function is needed to be able to plan, to be able to restrain your emotions in some situations, use them appropriately in other situations. It's actually a fairly complex form of behavior. Well, you know, if a child just gets up and starts walking, a kindergartner, and starts walking and grabs another child's thing, or it doesn't listen, or those are not good preconditions for learning, all right? So one of the things that we want to do in the early childhood period is to help the child develop impulse control, or develop, in a larger sense, executive function. There's a huge literature on this, and so I've been working with this particular literature. All right, So how do you do that? Well, there is a program that has been used increasingly. It's now about 15 years old, and we do have some true experiments, some randomized controlled trials in which what we do is provide a curriculum for children that help them to develop this impulse control. And it's a very interesting curriculum. I gave the example yesterday that often these children have difficulty listening, for example. They'll just suddenly start to talk out. The teacher is talking, they will suddenly, anyone who's taught at that age, I mean, has experienced these kinds of situations. It's not good for the child, it's not good for the classroom. So, one example, when I looked at the intervention, and this intervention is, there are many sessions, so this is just one example. One child is given a little plastic ear, the other child is given a little plastic mouth on a stick. And the children are taught, when you have the mouth, you can speak. When you have the ear, you listen. Then we will provide an indicator, maybe a bell, you change. And the child now who has the mouth can respond, and the child with the ear listens. And we teach them listening skills, we teach them speaking skills, but all in the form of a game. You could say, oh, this is terrible, you know, what you're doing is providing a structure. Yeah, there is a structure here, but it's in the context of a game. It's fun for them. That's what they see. They see this fun game. And from what we can tell in these experimental trials, and there's a literature on this, I can send you some of the references to it. What you do is you get very statistically significant effects on impulse control in children. These are in experimental studies in the children who have been exposed to this treatment. Now, the easiest thing to get this information, remember I gave you Steve Barnett's address, Nair. Let me give that to you. Everybody have their pencil ready? Yes. N-A-E-A-E-R-A. Nair, National Institute for Early Education Research. And this intervention is called Tools of the Mind. Tools of the Mind. Okay, so they have a huge amount of resources in the center that they can share by internet. And so if you look up Tools of the Mind and you look up the experimental studies of Tools of the Mind, and if you look at the description and the literature on this, you'll see a very concrete example that responds to your question. Yeah, now I should add that there are so many social and emotional areas. This is one, and it's a very important one, but there are many, many, many others. And I'm not familiar with all of the literature on all of these by any means. Okay?
And on the other hand, once they get to the adolescence, you know, it looks like they have, you know, lost all these
yes.
competencies that
yes.
were acquired during childhood, and so it's
yes, I don't really know whether they have lost them as much as whether they are in situations in which the contingencies around them reinforce some other things.
Yeah.
You know, you put the earphones in the ear, you have your smartphone here, or your juegos electrónicos, and then your friends is, oh, there's a Twitter message from your friends here. Oh, Facebook, I haven't looked at that for 5 minutes. You know, I am missing something there. This drives me crazy, I have to tell you that. In fact, I am the only person that I know that does not have a smartphone, has only a stupid phone, because I insist I will not get a smartphone because it will keep me too busy. I will develop these habits. That's what I mean by contingencies. I will develop these, what I consider to be inappropriate habits. You know, so I mean, yeah, there are peer effects in the teenage years. I'm not sure that they lack the ability, for example, the impulse control, but they don't exercise it.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Levin. Thank you, all of you, for coming and for your participation. For your participation. And I think that's all. Thank you again for your interesting ideas.